The Giuseppe Codex by Cohog 10. The date is March 2nd, 2019. Today marks the 10-year anniversary since I received my first research assignment as a history professor at The Ohio State University in Columbus. If you had visited me in my office around this time 10 years ago, or any time between February of 2009 and November of 2011, you would have most likely seen me analyzing a book on my desk. This dirty, brown, thick parchment-bound, battered manuscript, with centuries-old stains and faded writing in black and red ink. Vellum pages yellow with age and smelling of mildew and dust. It would have baffled you as much as it did me, even if you aren't a history scholar. At first glance, you would have noticed the book is obviously very old, with its pages falling out and its crude binding worn, but upon opening and scanning each page, you would be greeted with something out of an H.P. Lovecraft novel. Bizarre symbols and patterns, disturbing drawings, and cryptic writings inscribed in an unknown alphabet littered every one of the 319 pages, from cover to cover. The book was sent to me at Ohio State from Oxford University, where it had been stored in their archives since the 1880s. As part of my research project, all new professors are required to participate in. It was my job to trace the book's origin and possibly learn what its purpose was. To this day, even nearly a decade after being relieved of the document, I still lie awake at night wondering what the book was, what its purpose was, and where it came from. But it's not just because of its mysterious writing. Over the course of the near 3 years that I possessed the book, I could find very little information anywhere on it. It was never named, but has been passed down throughout history by many famous and important people for at least 1,000 years. Examples of individuals who have come into possession of this document include Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony and King of East Francia during the early 10th century. Alexio I of Trebizond, founder and emperor of the Trapezuntine Empire between 1204 and 1222. Pope Gregory XII, who served as the Pope between 1406 and 1415. Queen Mary I of England and Ireland, who ruled between 1553 and 1558. And Gian Battista Vico, an Italian Enlightenment philosopher who lived between 1668 and 1744. The last known owner of the book was Giuseppe Manzani, an Italian political activist and one of the three triumvirs of the short-lived 19th century Roman Republic restoration. After his death in 1872, the book was not passed down, but rather sold to Oxford professor William Scott and Berg, who researched the history of the document between 1872 and 1881, before abruptly abandoning his research and hiding the manuscript away within the basement archives of the university, where it remained undocumented until 2007, along with his notes. The book was finally sent to me and 3 of my colleagues for our modern research. Since the final owner of the book before Scott and Berg studied it was Giuseppe Manzani, our team of 4 was able to finally give the document its formal name, and we named it after him. We called it the Giuseppe Codex. Scott and Berg's notes served as our primary initiation to learning more about the Codex. His research, which mostly came from no longer existent primary sources, traced its origin to around the 4th or 5th century AD, in what was most likely the northern European region that was at the time dominated by the Lombards, outside the Roman Empire in what would be modern-day Germany, Poland, or Denmark. However, given that the book is written in a cryptic language that bears no resemblance to anything ever seen before, Scott and Berg doubted that it was written by the Lombards or any tribe or group related to them. He instead thought that it was written by a group that had lived in the area at the time and had little, if any, historical documentation. He theorized that the Codex was written for one of 4 purposes: as a sacred text from an obscure religion, cult, or mythology from the area, as a hunting guide, as a primitive medical document, or as a book of law. The drawings, which depicted many, seemingly random collages of artistically simplistic, yet distinct, humanoid and bizarre, non-humanoid figures, convinced him that the book was used for one of those 4 reasons. Another aspect regarding the mystery of the Giuseppe Codex that left Scott and Berg stumped was why the book was so important that it was passed down from the possession of multiple European historical figures since the 8th century, and how it ended up in their hands in the first place. The first historically known owner was Leo III, Byzantine emperor between 717 and 741, 300 or 400 years after its supposed writing, and it was passed down to numerous individuals from there. This was when historical documentations of the book's existence, as few as there were, began popping up. The book is mentioned in several primary documents written by the owners of the book or individuals who knew them personally, as a mysterious text that they couldn't understand, but that they kept anyway for unknown reasons. There were a few owners, such as Queen Mary I, who had barely any information regarding their ownership, or kept it in their archives or libraries on record, but made no other acknowledgement of its existence. Perhaps the most intriguing mystery, Scott and Berg wrote, is not its origin or its purpose, but rather how and why it was passed down to a series of historical individuals for over a millennium. Scott and Berg believed that each individual who owned the book belonged to a secret order, pact, or cult, and passed the document down throughout the generations to new members for unknown purposes. However, he had his doubts about this hypothesis because he could not draw a connection to any of the figures who owned the codex, or how they were related in any way beyond being rulers, kings, popes, philosophers, or other individuals throughout history. In addition, there were several moments throughout the book's existence where it was not owned by anyone important at all, or was lost, forgotten, or in storage. In 852, during the time of the book's disappearance, an Old Norse poem was written about a Viking warrior named Haskell Oakley, who owned a book of mysterious origin and mystical properties between 1343 and 1397. The book was owned by an obscure, barely known village chief in the Castile region of modern-day Spain, who passed the book down to his son before it somehow ending up in the hands of Pope Gregory XII in 1406. Between 1518 and 1649, Scott and Berg could not find a historical record anywhere regarding where the book was or who owned it, indicating that it was lost. Between 1787 and 1834, the book was stored in the hidden archives held from public view or study at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, England, and was labeled 15143. In 1834, the book reached its penultimate owner, Giuseppe Manzani, and finally the hands of William Scotenberg in 1872. Scotenberg studied the Giuseppe Codex for 9 years, and during that time dug up the majority of the information that I've detailed. He attempted to decipher the symbols and inscribings, but had no luck, as the drawings were too vague and the letters didn't match any language on Earth. His last page of notes was dated August 13th, 1881, and it didn't have any information regarding the codex. I remember it perfectly. He simply wrote, "I am hereby resigning my professional duties as of today. That book, that text, which I have studied for nigh on a decade, and what little information I could find, meant nothing. I don't think it was meant to be in my ownership. I am constantly having nightmares where I see red eyes staring at me from the end of a dark tunnel. I still see them by day. They never leave my vision. The runes, the eyes, the imagery, they never go away. I've been forgetting where I live. I don't like working anymore. I don't like living anymore. Goodbye, Oxford." While this message sounded ominous, even frightening, I was able to dig up more information about Scott and Berg and his life after retiring. Beginning in 1880, his confreres noticed that he was more withdrawn from social interactions and rarely left his office. His students also noticed a delay in his teaching patterns and a lack of enthusiasm. After retiring, he had a mental breakdown in 1886 and was locked in the Dorset County Lunatic Asylum, where he was diagnosed with acute mania. He was released from the hospital in 1892 and was reportedly almost senile, to which his daughter became his primary caretaker. When his former colleagues visited him and asked what he did with the book, he always refused to answer. On April 8, 1893, Scott and Berg hung himself in his son-in-law's home in Mayfair, London, at the age of 70. The Giuseppe Codex and his notes on it were not found again until 2007, deep within the archives of Oxford University. After its discovery, a team of professors briefly studied the book before sending it to Ohio State in 2009 as part of my research project as a new professor. The Giuseppe Codex is somewhat comparable to the infamous Voynich Manuscript, a text written in the early 15th century that is similarly written in an unknown language and contains bizarre illustrations. As part of the research curriculum, I was able to travel to Yale University and study the Voynich Manuscript myself, as I initially suspected that the Giuseppe Codex was related to it. The first reason being that the Giuseppe Codex predates the Voynich Manuscript by over a millennium. The Voynich Manuscript is also believed to have been created somewhere in northern Italy, while the Giuseppe Codex was created in modern-day Germany, Denmark, or Poland. Furthermore, the text and drawings within the two documents were completely different. The Voynich Manuscript's text is comparable to that of a modern Latin alphabet, but the symbolic alphabet of the Giuseppe Codex is something completely different, and is not recognizable or identifiable to any known communication system. The drawings are also different within the two, with the Voynich Manuscript containing more artistic works showing plants, people, zodiac signs, and astrological symbols. The Giuseppe Codex, however, details structures, stick figure-like people, animals, and even strange creatures. Today, most scholars believe that the Voynich Manuscript is a coded medical or alchemy book, which I happen to agree with. The Giuseppe Codex, however, was what I believed for years to be a book of the occult or mythology, which was one of Scott and Berg's original hypotheses. Another similar script to the Giuseppe Codex is a text known as the Voynich Codex, another document written in an unknown code from 18th century Hungary. The illustrations in this book are actually somewhat similar to the Giuseppe Codex, but many people believe that the Voynich Codex is a complete hoax. I wasn't even aware of its existence at the time of the research. While studying the Giuseppe Codex, I tried to write down as many notes as I could regarding what the symbols and drawings looked like. Unfortunately, I don't have them anymore. I will explain the circumstances leading up to that later, but I do have some. I'm not much of an artist, but one professor I worked with could copy the drawings fairly well, while I kept a record of all of the repeating symbols and letters within the codex and attempted to translate them into English letters, which I was never successful with. There were a few drawings that stood out to me, despite being simplistic in terms of quality, for being quite eerie. One of the drawings on the 18th page depicted some kind of cave or tunnel, possibly a tomb, with an eye on top of the frame. 4 arrows pointed up on either side, and on the left of the tunnel was some kind of DNA helix symbol. On the right was a bizarre figure with 11 appendages bent and curved in different directions, and what appeared to be a head with nothing but dots and lines covering where the face should have been. I have no idea what it was supposed to represent. The inside of the tunnel was painted with the thickest, darkest black ink in the entire book, most likely to show how dark it was inside. Above the structure were 4 more symbols that were repeated multiple times throughout the book, which we, as previously explained, were never able to translate. I believe that this drawing could be an actual structure somewhere in the world, and if it's ever found, could unlock more secrets regarding the Codex, assuming it still exists. There was another drawing in the book, on the 247th page, that still makes me nauseous thinking about it. I don't own the duplication anymore, unfortunately, and I'm not a good enough artist to replicate it by memory. But it was copied by the professor I previously mentioned, and he owned it for years. But everything that he possessed regarding the book probably doesn't exist anymore either. The picture showed various symbols on the left and right sides in vertical lines, the same repeating symbols that we had seen in all of the other pages. In the middle of the page was a drawing of a long, thin, otherworldly-looking creature standing in a side view from the waist up. Its arms stretched down and out of view, and it appeared to be covered in short fur. Its head was the most detailed and memorable part of the entire codex. Its appearance almost reminded me of a dinosaur or a dragon. It had a long, dog-like snout that housed a pair of intimidating jaws, with needle-sharp teeth jutting out of its closed mouth. Its only visible eye on the side of its face appeared to be an empty, narrow black socket slanted downwards, with a small red dot in the middle for the pupil. On the side of its head was a deep black dot for an ear, and on top were 2 horns that stretched up, curved once, and stuck out forward. For whatever reason, whenever any of the 4 of us stared at this particular page for a long enough time, we would start feeling sick. We could never explain why, but the page had such a powerful effect on all of us that I once threw up just by studying the drawing and the runes on the side, and so did one of my confreres. It was at this point, after only having the Codex in our possession for a few months, did we begin to feel something was a bit off about it. The idea of the book being cursed or having a spell cast on it almost became believable to us. This was the first time in my entire life that I started questioning the world around me, wondering if there was any truth to the paranormal stories we've all heard before. Was there something here that we couldn't explain through science? Was Scott and Berg trying to warn future readers of the book in his final message? Did he hide it for a reason? Did studying it for so many years do something to him that drove him insane and ultimately caused him to kill himself? What is this book? Who wrote it? And why did it even exist? I pondered these questions for years and still do today, but part of me didn't want to find out. I initially told my colleagues that I was planning on abandoning the research. They said I couldn't because my job depended on it. It was our responsibility to find out more about the Codex and perhaps crack the centuries-old mystery of its purpose. Over time, things only got stranger. After we noticed the sickening effect the book had on the 4 of us, I began to take notice of mysterious and disturbing incidents happening to me all around my home and in my daily life. We all took turns bringing the Codex home with us, although I'd say that I kept it overnight more than any of my 3 coworkers. And every time I brought it home with me, I experienced various unexplainable phenomena at home and on the run. It started with nightmares and sleep paralysis, something I had rarely experienced prior to owning the book. The dreams were eerily similar to what Scott and Berg describes in his last entry. I found myself walking down a dark tunnel with nothing but a lantern to light the way. As I tread down the dark, claustrophobic corridor, the fire from my lamp flickering off the rounded, damp walls and ceiling, a feeling of dread slowly washes over me, getting worse and worse Any attempt to turn around to look for where I came in is just met with more unending darkness. After walking around for 5 minutes, my lantern begins to dim, slowly burning out until flickering off and stranding me in the pitch black of the tunnel. I'm frozen in place for a few seconds until I can suddenly make out 2 red dots in the darkness. They look like eyes. They're staring at me. I can't move. At the same time, I can hear multiple whispers coming from where the eyes are down the tunnel. But I can't understand any of them. They sound like a language I've never heard before. And they sound inhuman, primordial, and worst of all, angry. They grow louder and louder. The feeling of dread switches to complete panic, and I finally begin to stir in my bed and wake up, usually sweating and unable to fall back asleep for the rest of the night. I had this same reoccurring dream at least 100 times over for the next 2 years. Nothing really changed whenever I had the dream either. The outcome was always the same. Sometimes I would just try to change the dream by turning around in the other direction and walking, but the same thing happened. Sometimes I just sat on the floor and waited for things to clear up, but the lantern blew out, and I was stuck with those same eyes and the whispers again anyway. Sometimes I would just try closing my eyes, but I usually couldn't. Any attempt to wake myself up failed. Every time I had the dream, I was stuck reliving it again and again and again. It got to the point where I didn't even like going to bed anymore because I just knew when I was going to be having it again, often after another night of studying the Codex. The worst part was the ending of the dream. The red dots always seemed to sit there in the middle of the tunnel and just stare at me. They never ran after me, and they never attacked me. They never disappeared until after I woke up, and the whispers almost stuck with me for about a minute after awakening. The staring was what made it so intense. The anticipation, feeling like they were just going to come barreling down the tunnel, and the last thing I would see before waking up was some hideous creature diving on me, rousing me with its blood-curdling cry as I jumped out of my bed, like most nightmares that I had had in the past. But that never happened. Instead, all I felt was tension as I anticipated something dramatic, but just woke up before anything happened. I had to sleep with the lights on after each nightmare, because I always felt something was watching me in my room as I jumped at every shadow. After having the dream multiple times in 1 month, I drew similarities to Scott and Berg's final note and started wondering if something else was causing me to have this dream rather than my paranoia. Was there something about the book that was causing me to have that dream over and over again? I thought there was, and that's why I wanted to just call off the research and get rid of the book. The sleep paralysis was even worse than the nightmares. It sometimes happened after waking up from the dream, and sometimes just waking up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I couldn't even tell I was paralyzed, and I thought I was in the middle of some strange dream. It usually lasted between a few seconds to about 2 minutes. But it often felt longer, even if I looked at the clock at a certain time and realized that not even a minute had gone by. I would just lay there, unable to move, although not panicking due to me either thinking I was dreaming or knowing what was going on. But when the hallucinations started, I could only hold my breath and hope that it ended soon. On a few occasions, when I first woke up and could still see the room in the morning, I would move my eyes to the right side of my bed, towards the open bedroom door, and see 4 long, gray, bony appendages, like fingers from some strange monster, gripping the doorframe from the outside. Once I finally roused myself, I jumped out of bed and they suddenly disappeared. I often checked my entire house for any sign of intrusion, but I found nothing. and I realized it was all just in my mind. When I woke up during the night, however, I would usually see the same pair of glowing red dots from my dream staring at me from the hallway, sometimes accompanied by a quiet, low-pitched breathing sound. Then they'd disappear, and I'd scour my house again for anything out of the ordinary, to no avail. I started closing my door at night after that, but that didn't stop the visions. I would still wake up and see the dots at the foot of my bed, watching me, always accompanied by the same breathing sound. Sometimes I thought I could make out a shadow surrounding the eyes, but I couldn't make out any details very well except for the fact that it looked too large to belong to a human. Often I'd see figures in the shadows dancing and waving around unnaturally from the streetlight or moonlight from outside, accompanied by similar-sounding primordial whispering from my dreams, quiet and barely detectable until it all subsided. I had so many sleepless nights because of these visions that I was exhausted throughout most of my days, to the point where I started drinking coffee and taking energy pills throughout my workday, something I had never done in my life prior to these incidents. Possessing the Giuseppe Codex was like a form of torture, as if the book itself, or some other force behind it, was tormenting me and making my day-to-day life miserable. The other 3 members of my research team claimed that they never experienced sleep paralysis, but they did occasionally have nightmares that were random and didn't relate to the recurring one that I had. There were many other examples of unnatural experiences that I had while in possession of the Codex. While returning home from work one night at 11 p.m., after parking my car in my driveway and carrying the Codex into the house, I could hear in the distance, several streets away, the deep howl of something. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was incredibly low-pitched and unnatural, and it didn't sound like any vehicle I had ever heard. It sounded like something was in pain and crying for help. After standing still for a few seconds and trying to think about what could possibly have made such an incommodious utilation, I was struck with a sudden feeling of dread and panic, like something was suddenly chasing me or stalking me. I went into the house as fast as possible, locked all the doors and windows, and slept on the couch with a handgun next to me. I heard scratching on the window that night around 2 in the morning, but upon looking outside, I saw nothing. This is the first time I've mentioned this situation to anyone. One night, when I was going upstairs to my room, I had reached the top of the dark stairs and looked down the hall, only to see what looked like a dark, shadowy apparition quickly bolt into the closet from my room. I slept at a close friend's house that night, and when I came back, I found nothing in mine. Another time I slept away at a friend's house was when I came home from work at night again and looked up at my house windows to see 2 red dots from my dreams quickly dart away in my room. And once I stayed overnight in a hotel when I stepped out of my bathroom shower and noticed the same cryptic runes from the Codex had been drawn on the mirror's condensation. I saw unidentifiable figures behind me in the mirror that disappeared before I could turn around to look at them. I heard whispers and inhuman sounds in the middle of the night. I lived out some of my days in complete misery and fear, wondering what was going on in my life and how I could possibly stop it. I didn't want to believe that the book was causing all of it, because I didn't believe in the paranormal. But the more the incidents happened, the more my beliefs were strained. I went to the doctor and a psychologist, and they determined that there was nothing wrong with me. I had a priest exorcise my house once, but the incidents kept occurring. I picked up the bottle for the first time in my life and drank my days and nights away, unable to reach out to anyone since everyone I talked to thought I was sick or demented. I even became addicted to prescription pills for a brief period, and I thought of taking Scott and Berg's route of committing suicide on a few occasions. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't be happy. And almost every aspect of my life was spent in fear of some kind of ancient specter or demon that I might have awakened, and that it might be stalking me, torturing me, hunting me. It was making my life a living nightmare, just as it had done to Scott and Berg so many years ago. And the most intriguing incident involving the Giuseppe Codex occurred near the end of my time with it, on November 13th, 2011. After a brief research session on both the internet and in the library, our team couldn't find any evidence pointing towards Scott and Berg's hypothesis on the book's origins in the 4th or 5th century. Most of the primary sources that he had originally used were unattainable, but we wanted to pinpoint the exact time of origin of the Codex so we could search for documents from that time frame. We decided to have it carbon dated. Since the book was made of parchment and vellum, both materials made from animal hide, we thought that carbon dating would be easy. We contacted the biology department of the university and asked them if we could give them a piece of each page and the cover, but they told us to deliver the entire book so as not to damage it. I was the one who brought it into the lab on November 14th, which was, unbeknownst to me, the last day I would ever be in possession of the Codex. And for that, I couldn't have been more grateful. But it didn't make the events that transpired after that any less mysterious. 4 days later, on November 18th, it was my day off, but as I lay in bed, wallowing in my depression as I normally did on those days, I got a phone call from the college. It was the laboratory. They carbon tested the Giuseppe Codex and found something remarkable. They wanted to see me immediately. Since I had nothing better to do that day, I decided to get dressed and head to my car to drive out to the university. When I got to the lab, 2 of my 3 colleagues were there, as well as the head biologist. The Codex was sitting on the desk in front of them. When I asked where our 4th researcher was, they told me he was given some unsettling news the previous night and hasn't been answering phone calls. Unsettling news, I asked them. "Sit down, Professor, and I'll explain what we found in our test," said the biologist. I sat down in front of the desk between my teammates, with the familiar book right in front of me. The head biologist was holding a yellow file. "Gentlemen, we attempted to carbon test the book you've been trying to research and originally received some atypical results. There didn't appear to be very much carbon within the book at all. At first, we thought that there must have been some sort of problem with the equipment or the process we used, since the material is very clearly animal parchment. But everything turned out to be in complete order. The team and I were completely blown away. There couldn't possibly be this little carbon in parchment, only thought to be less than 2,000 years old, when the half-life of carbon-14 is over 5,000 years. We decided to attempt a genetic test on the paper material and just got the results yesterday. They are beyond anything that I've ever seen." He threw the file on the table and opened it. Inside was a comparison of the elements of what is found in the genetic material of most of Earth's carbon-based life forms versus what was found in the material that made up the paper and binding of the Giuseppe Codex. The 6 most abundant elements that appear within all life on the planet are carbon, oxygen, calcium, phosphorus, hydrogen, and nitrogen. In the Codex, however, the most abundant materials were nitrogen, silicon, astatine, and 3 other elements that have never been discovered and appeared to have very unstable properties. Astatine is one of the most unstable elements in the periodic table, but for some unexplained reason, it stayed under control in the paper of the Codex. Whatever this book is, or what it's meant for, we know one thing for certain. It doesn't come from Earth. Whatever animal or thing the material comes from, its genetic material doesn't line up with anything on this planet. and it doesn't even appear to be scientifically plausible by our current standards. This is something much bigger than anything we could have ever dreamed of, and it seems that this is just the beginning," said the biologist. We were in awe and confusion. This codex we've been researching for almost 3 years is something completely extraterrestrial, something completely unknown. It couldn't even be explained by science. This could be one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time, and we never even knew until now. It could be proof of extrasolar life, the multiverse, or even paranormal entities and worlds beyond our own. It could be a prophecy of death or destruction, or a gateway to somewhere beyond our reaches. It could be the key to unlocking the secrets of the unknown, or the bane of our very existence. I now knew why I was experiencing so much unexplainable phenomenon. There was definitely something mystical or paranormal about the book, and nobody may ever be able to figure out what it is. Everything that had happened to me up until this point started to make a little more sense. But there was an even bigger can of worms opened with this discovery. "We have more tests to do, if you don't mind," the biologist said. "But this should be worth mentioning, that word has spread from here to other scientific communities. This will hit mainstream attention soon enough, and there's a chance that we will all become famous for discovering it. I've informed the university of your discovery, and they advise you to take some time off. I highly recommend that you all stay updated on this situation." I don't remember the drive home that day. In fact, I don't really remember anything else from that day except my thoughts. I didn't speak to any of my colleagues that were there. I just went straight to my car and straight home, and probably spent the day pacing back and forth in the halls of my apartment or laying on my couch, drowning in my own thoughts. I didn't drink. I didn't take any pills. I didn't communicate with anyone, and I didn't have any more paranormal experiences. I had so many unanswered questions. Was the codex written by humans, aliens, or something else entirely? What kind of material was it printed on, and why did it exist in the first place? What would this mean for me and the entire scientific community? I bombarded myself with these questions, but I somehow knew that they might never be answered. I tried to keep up with the news for the next 2 days, searching online and watching TV. I only found 2 or 3 local articles relating to the codex, but they were all titled something along the lines of, "Strange book from ancient times may have connection to ancient rulers," and they mentioned nothing about the physics-defying and paranormal properties of the book. I assumed that journalists and news organizations just didn't know how to properly explain something so extraordinary. When I checked the news again on the morning of November 20th, 2011, I was surprised to find nothing. I couldn't even find the previous articles from the last 2 days. They seemed to have been deleted from the internet. There wasn't a shred of information about the codex anywhere online, despite the fact that something so huge should have made global attention by now. Imagine my shock when my browsing session was cut short by a hard knock on my front door, followed by a man yelling, "Federal agents, you are required by law to open the door within 5 minutes or we will break it down." I was at the door faster than a bullet, and I opened it up to see 5 men in black and gray suits with sunglasses surrounding my door. "We have a warrant for search and seizure of this property," said the one standing closest to my door. "You are required by federal law to stay at a hotel until the process is finished. It will take no longer than a week. Do not speak to anyone about your experience, or you will go to prison. One of us will escort you to the hotel you are staying at, and all expenses will be paid for. Do not return home until we contact you again." One of the agents led me to his car and drove me to a nearby hotel. He showed me to my room and told me that they would provide all food and living expenses for the next week. I spent 6 days in that room, not leaving once in fear of being arrested or running into more government agents. I knew exactly what they wanted from me. They wanted to confiscate any evidence of the Giuseppe Codex's existence and any research that I possessed. They wanted to make sure that I didn't have any proof of what we had discovered. They knew that the book was dangerous and didn't want the truth revealed to the public. As of right now, I know that I could get into serious trouble for opening up the truth about the Codex on this website. I could get arrested, jailed, or even killed, but I don't care. The book affected my life so much that 10 years after my initial experience, I am willing to die for its cause. I'm posting this over several different proxies and the anonymous Tor browser on a computer I will destroy afterwards. The truth about the Codex must be revealed to the public, even if it cost me my life. 6 days later, they told me that I could go home. They gave me $10 million in hush money and told me to never speak a word about the book to anyone again, or I would face federal charges. They also told me to wait a month before returning to work. I searched my house and saw that everything was in order the way I had left it. But all of my research notes regarding the Codex were gone. All except for 2 sketches, which were drawn by me and my colleague. I had them in a journal that I owned, and the agents must have either not noticed that they were there, or saw them and assumed that they had nothing to do with the Codex. They are the only remaining evidence that I ever possessed the Giuseppe Codex. Here's what they looked like. I used the $10 million to buy a new house and a new car, and I put the rest in a savings account. When I went back to work, all 3 of my former research colleagues were gone, and I never saw or heard from any of them again. The university never mentioned the book to me again either. The lead biologist that I talked to on that day when I learned the truth was gone too, but I knew that I wasn't allowed to ask why. Since then, I've broken my addiction to alcohol and drugs. I've stopped experiencing nightmares and sleep paralysis, and I've turned my life around from that dark period in my life. But not a day has gone by since that I stopped thinking about the Codex and what it holds. I know that I'll never know the full truth about the Giuseppe Codex, but the least I could do was let everyone know that it exists, and that it could hold knowledge that our minds may not be able to understand. It's wrong for such a powerful book to be hidden from the public. And that's why I'm risking my life to let the world know about my experience. To let the world know that there's something out there that could answer questions that humans have been pondering since we started walking on 2 legs. Or it could hold the power to destroy us all. If this is the last time anyone hears from me, let the world know that I was a martyr for the truth. If this story were to ever be removed from here, copy and archive it so that everyone will have a chance to read it. The world deserves to know about the Giuseppe Codex.